The alarm buzzed before the sun even broke the horizon. Ethan Carter slapped it quiet and sat up, his shoulders heavy, his body aching from another late shift at the garage. Outside his small apartment window, the sky over their little Rust Belt town was still grey, the streets empty except for the hum of a distant freight train. He pulled on the same pair of work jeans he wore almost every day, the fabric stiff with oil stains that no wash cycle could erase. His hands were rough, knuckles scarred from years of tightening bolts and coaxing engines back to life. But this morning, his touch was gentle as he reached for the small white box on the counter. Inside was a chocolate cake, cheap, a little lopsided, but with Emma's name carefully written in white frosting. Today she was turning 8. It wasn't much. He knew that. Bills stacked on the counter reminded him of what he couldn't give her. Piano lessons she once asked about, braces she might need, even just a bigger place where she could have her own room. But the cake was what he could manage, and he placed it on the worn kitchen table with a single candle beside it. A few minutes later, soft footsteps padded down the hall. Emma appeared in the doorway, her hair sticking up in messy strands, her eyes still heavy from sleep. The moment she spotted the cake, her whole face lit up. "Daddy, you remembered." Ethan's throat tightened. He forced a smile and crouched down so they were eye level. "Of course I did, kiddo. How could I forget?" She ran into his arms, hugging him with a strength only a child could carry. For a brief second, the weight of his exhaustion lifted. The double shifts, the past due notices, the loneliness of coming home to an empty bed, all of it faded against the sound of her laugh. As she climbed into the chair and leaned over the cake, Emma whispered, "This is the best birthday ever." Ethan lit the candle, watching the tiny flame dance against her smile. He didn't say it out loud, but in that moment he promised himself something. No matter how hard life pressed him down, he would always find a way to give her a reason to smile. He didn't know that before the day was over, that promise would be tested in ways he never imagined. Later that afternoon, after school let out, Ethan and Emma stopped by the local supermarket. The sky had turned the colour of steel, the kind of pale grey that promised rain. Ethan grabbed a few essentials, milk, bread, a pack of candles Emma had begged for so she could light the rest of her cake that evening. The parking lot was crowded with shoppers loading groceries into trunks, carts clattering against metal racks. Ethan balanced 2 bags in one hand while Emma skipped beside him, humming a tune from music class, the backpack bouncing on her shoulders. For a moment, it was just an ordinary day, father and daughter heading home, clinging to small routines that kept life steady. Then it happened. A few rows ahead, near a sleek black car parked close to the entrance, a woman stumbled. At first Ethan thought she'd tripped, but then her body gave out completely. She crumpled onto the pavement, clutching at her chest. A small crowd gathered instantly, drawn by the sight. But instead of helping, people froze. Some gasped, some whispered, and too many reached for their phones. Emma tugged on his sleeve, her voice barely a whisper. "Daddy, what's wrong with her?" Ethan's chest tightened. He knew that look, the pale skin, the desperate way she fought for air. He had seen it before, on long nights in hospital rooms with his late wife. His body moved before his mind could catch up. "Stay here, Em," he said firmly, handing her the bags. He rushed toward the woman, dropping to his knees on the cold pavement. Up close, she looked like someone important. Tailored coat, diamond ring, a car that probably cost more than he made in a year. But in that moment, none of it mattered. She wasn't wealth or status or headlines. She was just a human being fighting to stay alive. "Somebody call 911, Ethan barked, his voice cutting through the murmurs. The woman's eyes fluttered, rolling back. Her lips parted as she tried to breathe, but nothing came. Ethan pressed his fingers against her neck, feeling for a pulse that was far too weak. His stomach clenched. "Hang on," he whispered, steadying his hands. "Don't you give up on me." The crowd stood still, cameras raised, but Ethan's world had narrowed to just this woman on the asphalt, the faint life slipping beneath his palms, and the terrified little girl watching from a few steps away. Ethan dropped his jacket to the side and placed his hands firmly on the woman's chest. His heart raced, but his movements were steady, almost automatic. He had done this before, years ago, in a desperate attempt to keep his wife alive until the doctors arrived. That memory burned in him now, fueling his focus. "Stay with me," he muttered, pressing down, counting in his head, willing her heart to respond. Around him, the circle of onlookers whispered, their voices a cruel background hum. "Is she okay? Someone should do something. Shouldn't we wait for the ambulance?" Anger sparked in him. Waiting was a death sentence. He leaned closer, giving a breath of air, then pressed again, his hands pumping with urgency. Emma stood a few feet away, clutching the grocery bags to her chest, her eyes wide and wet. "Daddy, the ambulance is coming," she cried, her small voice cutting through the noise. "They're almost here." Ethan didn't dare look up. "Good girl, Em, just stay back, I've got her." The woman's body jolted faintly beneath his hands. Then, after a terrifying pause, a weak gasp escaped her lips. Her chest rose unevenly, shallow but real. Relief surged through Ethan, though he kept his hands steady, guiding her until her breathing found a fragile rhythm. The wail of sirens finally filled the lot. Red and blue lights flashed against the glass storefront as paramedics rushed in with a stretcher. One of them knelt beside Ethan, quickly checking the woman's vitals. "If you hadn't started when you did," the medic said, glancing up at him, "she wouldn't have made it." Ethan exhaled for what felt like the first time in minutes, his arms trembling from the effort. He stepped back, sweat dripping down his temple, as the medics lifted the woman onto the stretcher. Her eyelids fluttered, and for the briefest moment her gaze met his. There was fear there, but also something else, something fragile like gratitude left unspoken. And then she was wheeled into the back of the ambulance, the doors slamming shut, the sirens pulling her away into the night. Emma rushed into his arms, hugging him tightly, her small frame shaking. He kissed the top of her head and whispered, "It's okay now, she's going to be all right." But as he stood there in the fading glow of the sirens, Ethan had no idea how much this night had just changed both of their lives. That night, after Emma had fallen asleep with her sketchbook still open on the couch, Ethan sat alone at the kitchen table. A single lamp lit the pile of unopened bills in front of him, their red stamps shouting louder than the quiet apartment. He tried to push the memory of the parking lot aside, but it kept replaying in his mind. The gasping breaths, the weight of his hands pressing down, the look in the woman's eyes before the sirens took her away. He told himself it was over. He'd done his part. People like him didn't cross paths with people like her, not beyond a single desperate moment. Then the television caught his attention. The evening news anchor spoke over footage of flashing lights outside the very supermarket he and Emma had left hours earlier. Margaret Whitmore, one of the most powerful business figures in the state, was rushed to the hospital tonight after a sudden cardiac episode. Sources say she is now in stable condition thanks to the quick actions of a bystander who performed CPR until paramedics arrived. Ethan froze. The screen showed her photograph, polished, confident, the face he had only ever seen on billboards and the business section of the newspaper. He knew the name, everyone did. Margaret Whitmore, owner of half the downtown skyline, a woman the media called cold, untouchable, ruthless. But the woman he'd held on the pavement hadn't looked powerful at all. She had looked fragile, human. "Daddy?" Emma's sleepy voice carried from the hallway. She had woken and padded out, rubbing her eyes. "Is that her, the lady you helped?" Ethan nodded slowly, still staring at the screen. "Yes, sweetheart, that's her." Emma tilted her head, studying the photo on TV. "She looked lonely," she said softly, and then yawned, as if the observation cost her no effort at all. Her words struck him harder than the headlines. Lonely. Not rich, not famous, lonely. Only a child could have seen it so clearly. Ethan tucked her back into bed, smoothing her hair until her breathing grew steady again. But long after the apartment was quiet, he sat awake in the dim light, the news anchor's words echoing in his mind. Stable condition, thanks to a bystander. He told himself that was the end of it, that he and Emma would slip back into their lives and she into hers. But deep down, something told him the night in that parking lot was only the beginning. 3 days passed before the phone call came. Ethan was elbow deep in an engine at the garage when his cell buzzed in his pocket. He almost ignored it. He never had time for spam calls. But something made him answer. "Mr. Carter?" a calm voice asked. "This is St. Mary's Hospital. Mrs. Whitmore has requested to see you, and your daughter, if possible." For a second, Ethan thought he'd misheard. "Whitmore?" "Yes, sir, she insists. Today, if you can." Ethan stood frozen, greasy rag in hand, the sound of drills and hammers fading around him. His first instinct was to refuse. People like her didn't really need people like him. But when he looked at Emma later that evening, eyes wide with curiosity after he explained, he found himself agreeing. The hospital smelled the same as it always did, sharp with antiseptic, humming with fluorescent lights. Ethan hated it. Too many memories lived in walls like these. Emma clung to his hand as a nurse led them down a quiet hall, past suits standing guard at the door. They hesitated, but the nurse waved them through. Inside, Margaret Whitmore sat propped against a mountain of pillows. She looked smaller than Ethan remembered, wrapped in a pale blanket, her hair pulled back loosely instead of styled for the cameras. For a long moment, her gaze lingered on him, studying his face like she'd been waiting for it. Then her eyes softened when they fell on Emma. "You came," she said, her voice low, raspy but steady. Ethan cleared his throat, unsure where to look. "They said you wanted to see us." "I did." She turned to Emma, her expression warming in a way Ethan hadn't expected. "And you must be the brave girl who ran for help." Emma's cheeks flushed pink. She hid halfway behind her father's arm. "My name's Emma," she whispered. Margaret repeated the name softly, almost to herself, and for a brief second her composure cracked. "Emma," she said again with a faint smile. "That's a beautiful name." Silence filled the room, the kind that wasn't awkward but heavy, like something unspoken sat between them. Margaret broke it first. "You didn't hesitate," she told Ethan, her eyes sharp now, searching. "Everyone else stood frozen, but you moved. Why?" Ethan shifted uncomfortably, rubbing a hand across the back of his neck. "Because she wasn't just some stranger lying there. She was someone's mother, someone's daughter. You don't just walk past that." Margaret's throat worked as she swallowed. For years, she had been described as numbers, headlines, assets. Yet here was a man who had looked at her and seen only a person worth saving. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she smiled. And it wasn't the polished smile that had graced business magazines, but something raw and fragile. "Most people forget I'm human," she whispered. "You reminded me." Ethan didn't know what to say. He wasn't looking for gratitude. But as Emma inched closer to the bedside, her small hand reaching to rest near Margaret's, he realised this meeting was about more than thanks. It was about something beginning. Ethan thought the hospital visit would be a one-time courtesy, but it wasn't. A few days later, another call came. Margaret wanted to see them again. He almost said no. He didn't want Emma dragged into anything complicated. But his daughter's face lit up at the invitation, and he couldn't bring himself to deny her. Each time they stepped into that quiet private suite, the atmosphere seemed to change. Margaret, who the world saw as unshakable, asked not about business or headlines, but about Emma. She wanted to hear about school, about the drawings stuffed into her backpack, about the small things that made up their life. One afternoon, Emma pulled out a crayon sketch she'd been working on while Ethan sat nearby. It showed 3 stick figures holding hands, her father, and a woman with kind eyes. She slid it across the blanket shyly. "That's you," she said. Margaret's hand trembled slightly as she touched the paper. Her jewellery sparkled under the fluorescent lights, but it was the crude lines of a child's drawing that caught her breath. "No one's drawn me like this in years," she whispered. "Not as a person." Ethan, leaning against the window ledge, felt something shift in the room. He had only ever seen Margaret through the distance of headlines and reputation. Now he was watching her break, quietly, almost gratefully, at the touch of a child's honesty. Margaret looked at him suddenly, her voice quieter. "Emma told me you once sold your wedding ring to pay for hospital bills. Is that true?" Ethan stiffened. He hadn't expected Emma to share that. He gave a short nod. "Yeah. When my wife got sick, the insurance didn't cover everything. It was all I had left worth anything." For a moment, Margaret said nothing. Then she lowered her eyes. "I've spent most of my life surrounded by people who only see me for what I own. But you..." She stopped herself, shaking her head as if the words were too raw. Emma, sensing the silence, filled it with childlike certainty. Daddy always says people matter more than money. Margaret smiled at that, small, genuine, unpolished, the kind of smile that looked as if she hadn't worn it in a long time. When Ethan and Emma left that evening, he walked the corridor in silence, his daughter skipping at his side, clutching her drawing-like treasure. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had cracked open in that hospital room, something Margaret herself hadn't planned, and something he wasn't sure he was ready for. But it was there, undeniable, and it was only growing. Ethan hoped the visits would stay private, just quiet moments in a hospital room no one else needed to know about. But the world had other plans. By the end of the week, his phone started buzzing with messages from co-workers and neighbours. Someone had leaked the story. Headlines spread online and across the evening news. Local mechanic saves billionaire. At first, some articles praised him as a hero, but others twisted it into something else entirely. From Greece to glory, one headline sneered. Another speculated, is this just the beginning of a Cinderella tale? At the garage, the whispers became harder to ignore. One of his co-workers smirked as Ethan walked past. Guess you won't be turning wrenches for long. She'll probably buy you a house. Another muttered under his breath. People will do anything for attention. Ethan clenched his jaw and kept working, pretending not to hear, but the sting settled deep. He hadn't asked for this. All he'd done was what anyone should have done. Yet now, somehow his motives were being questioned. At home, it wasn't much better. The mail started piling higher than usual. Mixed in with bills were letters from strangers, some kind, thanking him, others harsh, accusing him of seeking fame or handouts. He shredded the cruel ones before Emma could see them, but the weight of it pressed on him. Meanwhile, across town, Margaret faced her own storm. In a boardroom full of polished suits, her advisors circled her like vultures. One slapped a magazine onto the table. On the cover, a grainy photo of her hospital window with the caption, "Whitmore's Mystery Guests." "This isn't wise," one of them warned. "Investors are calling. They want reassurance that your focus is on the company, not charity cases." Another leaned forward, his tone sharper. "A mechanic with a child doesn't belong in your orbit, Margaret. You need distance." Margaret closed the magazine without flinching, though her fingers lingered on the edge of the page. Later that evening, she called Ethan. Her voice was quieter than he'd ever heard it. "I'm sorry," she said. "I never meant to pull you and Emma into this circus." Ethan leaned against the kitchen counter, the weight of her words heavy in his chest. Emma sat at the table behind him, colouring in silence. "It's not your fault," he told her. "People talk. They always will." But long after the call ended, he found himself staring at the cracks in the ceiling, unable to sleep. The thought crept in, unshakable. Maybe he and Emma didn't belong anywhere near Margaret Whitmore's world. Maybe the only way to protect his daughter was to walk away before the storm swallowed them whole. The whispers at the garage hadn't stopped. By now, Ethan had learned to keep his head down, fixing engines, while the gossip buzzed around him like gnats he couldn't swat away. But some days, it was harder than others. That morning, a customer eyed him skeptically as he wiped his hands on a rag. "You're the guy from the news, aren't you? The mechanic who saved her?" Ethan gave a small nod, trying to keep it professional. The man snorted. "Guess we'll be seeing you on magazine covers next, huh? Must be nice, catching that kind of break." A couple of co-workers laughed quietly nearby. Ethan bit down on the response rising in his throat. Pride burned, but he forced himself to focus on the bolts in front of him. He wasn't going to give them the satisfaction. And then the sound of heels cut across the concrete floor. Sharp, steady, out of place in a room that usually smelled of oil and gasoline. The chatter died instantly, every head turned. Standing in the doorway was Margaret Whitmore. No assistants, no press, no polished entourage, just her, in a plain coat and flat shoes, her posture commanding in the way of someone who had nothing to prove. The garage fell silent. Ethan froze, wrench still in his hand. Margaret walked straight toward him, her eyes fixed on his. "Mr. Carter," she said clearly, her voice carrying through the shop, "you saved my life. I owe you a debt I can never repay, and I want everyone here to know it. Murmurs rippled through the room. The same customers and co-workers who had whispered about him now stared, caught off guard. Ethan shifted uncomfortably, wishing the floor would swallow him whole. "Mom, that's not necessary." "I am on some aid." "Yes, it is," she cut in firmly. She turned, addressing the room, her voice steady as steel. "I've heard the talk. I know the headlines. But let me make this clear. This man didn't act for attention. He didn't ask for anything. He stepped forward when everyone else stood still. That isn't luck. That's character." The weight of her words filled the garage. No one dared look her in the eye. Emma, who had been waiting by the doorway after school, ran up and grabbed Ethan's hand. Her small voice broke the silence. "That's my daddy." Margaret's expression softened. She crouched slightly, looking at Emma with a genuine warmth that cut through the air. "You should be very proud of him," she said. Emma nodded quickly, squeezing her father's hand. "I am." Ethan blinked hard, heat rising in his chest. He wasn't used to being defended, not like this, not in front of people who had looked down on him his whole life. And as he stood there, caught between embarrassment and something that felt dangerously close to pride, a quiet thought took root. Maybe their lives weren't as far apart as he had always believed. A few days after her visit to the garage, Ethan thought things might finally calm down. He slipped back into routine, fixing engines, juggling bills, walking Emma home from school. Life felt almost normal again, but then Margaret called. Her voice was steady, but held something personal. "I'd like to ask you for a favour," she said. Ethan frowned. "From me?" "Yes," she replied. "I have an old car. It belonged to my father. No one's been able to bring it back to life, no matter how much I paid them. I want you to try." Ethan hesitated. "Mrs. Whitmore, I'm not sure I'm the right guy. I don't have a fancy shop or special equipment. I'm just a small-town mechanic." "That's exactly why I'm asking you," she said, "because you care, and sometimes that matters more than tools or titles." Her words left him quiet. Against his better judgment, he agreed. That weekend, a flatbed truck delivered the car to the garage after hours. It was a faded blue classic, once elegant, now worn down by time, dust coating the hood, leather seats cracked like old skin. Ethan walked around it slowly, running a hand over the dents and rust. To anyone else, it might have looked like a pile of junk. To him, it looked like a challenge. Emma sat nearby on a stool, her backpack on the floor, swinging her legs as she watched. "Do you think you can fix it, Daddy?" Ethan gave her a tired smile. "We'll see. Some things take more than just a quick fix." He worked late into the night, his hands blackened with grease, sweat dripping onto the concrete floor. Hours stretched, broken only by the sound of tools clinking, and Emma occasionally passing him a wrench or flashlight. By midnight, exhaustion pulled at him, but he refused to quit. And then, with one final turn of the wrench, the engine coughed, then roared to life. The garage filled with a deep, steady rumble. Ethan leaned back, breathless, grinning despite himself. Emma clapped, eyes wide. "You did it! It's alive again!" The next morning, Margaret arrived in person. When she saw the car purring smoothly, her composure cracked. She stepped forward, laid a hand on the hood, and for a long moment, her face softened in a way Ethan hadn't seen before. "I never thought I'd hear this sound again," she whispered. "It feels like a piece of my father is still here." She turned to Ethan, her voice steady but full of something more than gratitude. "I don't just want to thank you. I want to hire you. I own a collection, vehicles, machines, that deserve the same care you gave this one. I want you to take charge of them, permanently." Ethan froze. The offer sounded like a lifeline. A steady job, real security, a chance to give Emma more than just enough to scrape by. But another part of him balked. Pride. Fear. The voice in his head whispering that men like him didn't belong in her world. Margaret seemed to sense his hesitation. She glanced at Emma, then back at him. "Don't answer now. Just think about it. Not for me. For her." Ethan's chest tightened. He looked at Emma, who stood by the car with a hopeful smile, eyes shining with belief in him. And he knew the decision wasn't just about pride anymore. Ethan barely slept after Margaret's offer. He sat at the kitchen table long into the night, the soft buzz of the refrigerator filling the silence. Bills lay scattered across the wood grain, reminders of the life he had fought so hard to keep afloat. A steady job, real security, was everything he had prayed for, And yet, pride gnawed at him. Would taking her offer mean admitting he couldn't stand on his own? Would people whisper that he had only survived because a rich woman swooped in? The weight of those questions followed him into the morning. As he walked Emma to school, she skipped beside him, swinging her backpack, carefree in a way he wished he could be. Halfway down the block, she looked up at him with that innocent clarity only children seem to have. "Daddy," she asked softly, "are you going to say yes?" Ethan blinked. "To what, sweetheart?" "To Miss Margaret," she said. "I heard her. She wants you to fix her cars. She trusts you." Emma stopped walking, tilting her head in that way that made her look older than her years. "You always tell me not to be afraid to try. So why are you afraid?" The words struck deeper than any headline ever could. He crouched so he was level with her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Because sometimes grown-ups forget how to be brave. Emma squeezed his hand firmly. "Then maybe you should remember." That night, Ethan picked up the phone. His voice was steady, though his heart pounded. "If the offer still stands," he told Margaret, "I'll take it, but not because I need saving, because I want to give my daughter something better." On the other end, Margaret's voice softened, warmer than he'd ever heard it. "That's exactly why I asked you." In the weeks that followed, Ethan's life began to shift. He worked with Margaret's collection, restoring old machines with the same patience and grit he had always carried, but now with a sense of stability he had never known. Emma spent afternoons sketching quietly in the corner of the shop, sometimes holding up a new drawing just to see him smile. Margaret stopped by often, bringing her books, asking about school, and always finding time to sit and listen. One crisp evening, the three of them stood outside the garage as the old blue car rumbled steadily, its engine alive again. Margaret laid a hand on the hood, her eyes full of memory. Emma slipped her small hand into hers, then into Ethan's, linking them together. For a moment, the world fell away. No cameras, no headlines, no whispers, just three people connected not by wealth or circumstance, but by something deeper. Ethan glanced at Emma, then at Margaret, and for the first time in years he felt something that had eluded him, hope. Because sometimes the biggest changes don't come from miracles or money. They come from choosing to step forward when others stand still, and from the unexpected people who walk into your life and remind you what truly matters. True wealth isn't measured in money or status, but in character, kindness, and the courage to step forward when others stand still. Thank you for staying with us until the very end of this story. I'm truly grateful for your time. If you enjoyed it, please give this video a like and subscribe to support the channel. I'll see you again soon, right here on Rain Inside.